Hey everyone, my name's Ailert, the person who edits all of the videos you see hosted on our channel, and today I'm once again joined by...
Alexander Kazina.
Correct, and in this sixth episode of our franchise interview show, we're going to be taking a look at a buried, hidden gem series of games you may have never heard of called Zelda. It's created by a little-known indie studio called Nintendo, and has been released on the game consoles and handhelds carrying this company's name. I'll be asking Alexander some questions in an effort to shine a light on a series the video game industry has very much overlooked. Are you ready, Alex?
Yes, and I just want to say, considering that I don't think that the words Nintendo or The Legend of Zelda have ever been heard in a video on the main GVMERS channel, I'd have to agree with you that it is pretty niche.
Well, that's good to hear. Good to hear that we're kind of shining a light on a series that is very much in need of doing so. So you're ready, right?
Yes, 100%.
Cool. So the Zelda series has existed in both 2D and 3D form for some time. Which do you prefer, and what do you feel really sets the two apart aside from difference in dimension? And what do you think? What are some things that you feel work better in a 2D environment or a 3D environment, and vice versa?
A lot to unpack here. So, yeah, ever since the release of The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time in 1998, the Zelda series has had, both 2D and 3D form. And it's interesting because I feel like there are not a lot of other series out there that you can kind of say the same thing about. Usually when a series, takes on a brand new form or approach, or it fully makes a transition from one dimension to the other, it kind of exists in perpetuity in that new state. And in that regard, Zelda is really unique in that you've had these two dueling versions of the series existing side by side as recently as last year with the release of the remake of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. Technically, I guess you could call that 2.5D because it's all 3D graphics, but the point is that you're playing on a 2D plane. So yeah, I mean, obviously, in addition to the change in, dimension, a lot of the kind of puzzles in the 2D Zelda games, like I find that you'll find consistently that the environment itself in the 2D Zelda games is a lot more of a puzzle in of itself, whereas that's not really true so much of the 3D Zelda games. There are plenty of puzzles to be found kind of scattered throughout the environments of the 3D Zelda games, but the puzzles there tend to be a little bit more secluded in individual spots. Whereas in 2D Zelda games, it kind of feels like, oh, this entire area is a big kind of puzzle in of itself. Obviously, one of the other things about the 3D Zelda games is that because they're fully in 3D, they're, a lot better at kind of like conveying, intimate emotions. You get to see characters' facial expressions in ways that you normally don't get to when you're in the 2D games, even in some of the more like 2.5D games as of recent, like Link's Awakening and The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, which was released on the 3DS in 2013. However, I still think that, across both of them, they both have pretty good characters, certainly very memorable characters. I would say that, overall, this is a tough question for me to answer in terms of which one I prefer most. I think they both, have their merits. I'm going to just say I prefer 3D just because I think my favorite Zelda games are I have more favorite Zelda games that are within the realm of 3D than there are Legend of Zelda games within the realm of 2D. Like, one of the problems is that 3D games are a lot better at being cinematic, and I say that I tend to prefer cinematic video game experiences. But the 2D games absolutely have their appeal, and I would say are in no way obviously and objectively inferior to what the 3D games offer.
Okay, that's pretty clear. Cool. Yeah, and I do believe that also in a 3D environment, you really get to see the Zelda series' hallmarks of high fantasy, which is typically isn't really talked about in the same breath as games like The Witcher or Dragon Age or Elder Scrolls. And asking you, why is that? Why is that, and what sets Zelda apart from these games in terms of high fantasy?
So I'm not the first person to make this comparison. There are definitely many other people that have, pointed this out before. But really, when it comes down to it, the Legend of Zelda games are more. They share more DNA with a Hayao Miyazaki movie than they do with, say, The Lord of the Rings. You think about a Hayao Miyazaki movie. You think about, My Neighbor Totoro. You think about Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind. These movies are, at times dark and frightening, but they are ultimately very kind of serene and, paint a fantasy that is very kind of distinctly different from the, Witchers and Dragon Ages and Elder Scrolls of this, of the kind of video gaming, or, well, not just video gaming, but of like the fandoms of the world in general. And I imagine we'll probably get into this a little bit more further on in this interview, but like one thing that really kind of sets these Zelda games apart and that really makes them much like Hayao Miyazaki movies is that they're not super lore intensive in the way that you think about The Witcher or Dragon Age. Typically, throughout the history of the Zelda series, there are not like journals that you can just pick up scattered on the ground here and there and read an entire passage about the history of this continent or such and such. They, much like Hayao Miyazaki movies, are really only as deep as kind of they need to be to, tell their story and to, imbue their plot with the kind of emotion that they need to invest the player. And also, I mean, there is the fact that like, obviously The Witcher and Dragon Age and Elder Scrolls all do this as well, but you do have a melding of a lot of different other cultural artifacts in the Zelda series that are not just like Tolkien, like European-esque. Like, for example, you have rupees, which are these gems which, share the same name as the rupee, which is from India, for example. You have, a lot of Asiatic influences, particularly most recently in Breath of the Wild, where there's an entire town in that game, Kakariko Village, where, that kind of Asian influence is very kind of apparent. And yeah, I'd say that a bit long, bit rambling there, but I'd say that that's more or less why people don't really kind of put them in the same category. And of course, that's excluding the fact that gameplay wise, obviously the Zelda series is a lot more puzzly than the likes of The Witcher or the Dragon Age or Elder Scrolls as well. That much is obvious, so I didn't really bring that up, but obviously that's worth pointing out.
Yeah, it's kind of comparable to games like Ni no Kuni and Grand Blue, where they also kind of exist more in their own high fantasy bubble than, being compared to like Dragon Age or Elder Scrolls. Music is very integral to almost every video game, but people really speak highly of that of Zelda. Why do you think that music is such an integral part of the Zelda franchise?
So there are kind of multiple facets to this. I think that one thing that needs to be pointed out whenever you talk about the music in the Zelda series is that music isn't just something that you hear in the background of those games. It's typically also a mechanic in of itself. Most Zelda games, well, maybe not most, maybe more like half, which is still a pretty sizable percentage, have some sort of like musical instrument or something equivalent that you can play that basically triggers the environment around you to do something or allows you to kind of move the story forward. Obviously everybody knows the ocarina, which, was featured in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. But Majora's Mask also introduced like, hey, you can also play a guitar. There are also horns. There are also drums. In Twilight Princess, your wolf will howl and basically can make tunes in that regard. So, yeah, music, it's really integral because it's, literally ingrained in the mechanics of the game. And also, I think that the music really sticks out as well because at its heart, a lot of the greatest songs in the Legend of Zelda series are really, really kind of quite simple. I was thinking about this ahead of this interview. There's this one song that was featured in the Command and Conquer series that I'm sure you know. I believe it's called Hell March.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that. And I'm like, that song is also really memorable.
Correct.
And I think the reason why it is because it's a relatively kind of simple tune. It's like, na 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 na. Yeah, so on and so forth. Yeah. And, for that reason, it's really kind of easy to stick in your head. And a lot of these Zelda songs kind of operate in the same fashion.
For sure.
Like, they have it's just like one, 2 or 3 notes that basically they repeat over and over again, but like in more and more increasingly kind of complex ways over and over. Like Zelda's Lullaby, no, 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 no. Like when you actually listen to like an orchestral version of that song, it's, really complex and, impressive, but at its core, it's very simple as well. And that's, I think, resulted in the music of the series, enduring in a way that I feel like a lot of other, high fantasy series music has not quite.
Yeah, with the exception of maybe titles like Elder Scrolls, which has also a really distinct theme. I'd agree with you. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I feel like you couldn't walk 2 steps in 2011 without hearing the song from the trailer for that game.
Yeah, for sure. So the Zelda series has featured many different art styles over time. What are your favorite, and why did some art styles take off where others didn't? What would you have to say about the controversy surrounding Wind Waker's art style when it first debuted?
So, quick question. I know that this interview is, supposed to be you interviewing me, not me interviewing you. Yeah. But were you kind of at all aware or abreast of any of the controversy surrounding the Wind Waker's art style when that game was in development?
I was actually an employee at my local game store back when Wind Waker released, and I did catch some of the controversy that came along with it, but I never really understood why. I did understand that you had games like Link's Awakening, which has really its own art style, and you have I forgot the one with you have Zelda and you have Link on the cover, and it's kind of more realistic in a way. I forgot the
Twilight Princess.
Twilight Princess, that's the one. And there always seems to be a divide between art styles within the community, but I that's about as far as my knowledge goes in this regard.
Yeah, so you had the Zelda series start out the way it did in the 2D realm. Then it shifted over to 3D with Ocarina of Time. And, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were not overtly dark or gritty in their appearance, but they definitely represented a slight shift to a more realistic art style. And this is kind of a key piece to kind of understanding a lot of fans' frustration, is that there used to be this event that was held called Space World during the early 2000s, where Nintendo basically would show off stuff. It was kind of like a mini little E3 for Nintendo to unveil cool new projects that they were working on. And at Space World, they showed off a demo that was basically, it was like Link and Ganon as they appeared in Ocarina of Time, but with the kind of graphics that would have been possible on the GameCube at the time. And so a lot of people looked at this demo and they're like, oh shit, this is the direction that the Legend of Zelda series is going into. It's going to become increasingly dark and gritty and realistic. And then, I think a year after showing off of that demo, they showed off the Legend of Zelda, the Wind Waker. And they're like, hey guys, here's the new Zelda game. And everybody collectively was kind of like, wait a minute, what's going on here? This isn't at all what you had promised us. And nowadays, a lot of people, have come to really kind of love The Legend of Zelda, the Wind Waker's art style. And it's because, although it wasn't what they had promised them a year prior, looking back in retrospect, it was apparent that The Legend of Zelda, the Wind Waker's art style was very much still keeping in tone with the art styles of the other series and other games in the series. If you ever open the instruction manual to the original Legend of Zelda or A Link to the Past, some of the early 2D games, the art style that was present in them is very, like, it's not directly analogous, but what Wind Waker did was not a far cry from what those games were doing. And so, yeah, ultimately, the Wind Waker was able to kind of endure in time for that reason. And if you recall, after the Wind Waker, The Legend of Zelda saw the release of Twilight Princess, which, arguably in response to the critical reception of Wind Waker, went with a more gritty, mature, realistic art style, very clearly inspired by the Lord of the Rings films, which were coming out around the same time. And Twilight Princess has had kind of an interesting history within the Zelda community. Is really loved when it came out, because there were a lot of people at the time who were still like, man, I was really disappointed by the art style of the Wind Waker. I want to like Twilight Princess more. Then, in response to in response to the Wind Waker being liked more, Twilight Princess became much less popular. And over time, it's kind of evened out, where people have been like, Twilight Princess's art style is not aged as well as the Wind Waker, but it's actually, from a game perspective, a really, really good game, and I really respect it for that.
I see. Well, just touching up on the Wind Waker, what I said before, I was not actually an employee when Wind Waker was released. I was an employee when Wind Waker HD was released, so I kind of got those two mixed up. But yeah, whenever this happens, you have the community that splits itself into like subcategories. For every Zelda, there seems to be a fandom that seems to favor whatever direction Nintendo chose to go in with that particular art style. How do you feel about these kind of the groups dividing themselves among the Zelda fandom?
I mean, I will say nowadays I feel like those divides aren't as bad as they used to be. I would say that, when I was really growing up and when it was really my kind of interest in the Zelda series was at its peak, that's definitely when I'd say that the divides were more sharp. Nowadays, you have a bit of a new divide that's forming between people that really enjoy the direction that Breath of the Wild took the series and people who didn't quite enjoy it as much. Because Breath of the Wild, it bucked a lot of Zelda conventions in an effort to really liven up that series gameplay. But even there, you have a lot of people, again, like myself, who look at it and are like, I didn't necessarily love Breath of the Wild, but I really respect Nintendo for doing what they did with that game. Yeah, I mean, look, every fan base has its issues that divide them. And, not to be like, oh, the Zelda fan base is better than X fan base, but I don't think it's the kind of hostility that I've seen among Zelda fans is definitely not as bad as I've seen amongst some other bases. But then again, I also tend to not look into hostility and toxicity online anyways, so I can't claim that I have a PhD in that stuff either.
I understand. It's very good for your sanity to kind of keep yourself distanced as far as possible from those discussions as you can. Going back briefly to Breath of the Wild, though, it did kind of mark itself as this step forward in terms of openness. How do you feel that kind of experiment packed out for the series as a whole?
Right. So, the original Legend of Zelda way back in the day was a largely open-ended experience. There was a suggested order that you needed to kind of complete the game in order to have the easiest going time, but you could, in theory, tackle almost any dungeon in that game in any order. Then, as this kind of series went on, it gradually became more and more of a guided experience. You could still kind of take on certain dungeons out of order, but, it wasn't as non-linear as it used to be. And eventually it kind of got to the point with Skyward Sword, which is kind of the breaking point, where people are like, this game is just a little bit too linear. This is kind of dragging down the series as a result. And so Breath of the Wild basically did a complete 180 in that regard, and it totally brought to a new kind of level of non-linearity to the series, to the point that, and this is well known at this point, but by using a combination of very kind of clever exploits and tricks, you can get yourself to the final boss of the game within under half an hour and basically beat him. Yeah, if you choose to. Okay. As a consequence of that, though, because it's adopted this more kind of non-linear design, its story, is definitely not as, I'd say, strong as some previous other titles in the series, and that was kind of a bit of a drawback to me, because the idea is that when you tell a story, when you create much more of a non-linear game, you have to assume that some players are not going to miss certain story beats, so you don't place as much of an emphasis on the story to begin with, so you don't feel like they're missing out. And also the design of the world was designed such that while there are 4 kind of temples, quote unquote, that you can explore throughout the world, these temples don't feel as kind of monumentous as some of the temples in previous Zelda games. I think that Breath of the Wild is a fantastic game, and it's a fantastic melding of like Zelda style charm with a lot of like really physics rich systems. Again, like I don't know who you are, but if you have not seen some of the crazy stuff people have done with the physics in this game, go look it up on YouTube because it is incredible. But it definitely, as I said earlier, it definitely has created a little bit of a divide as a result of its move towards nonlinearity. And I'm hoping that with Breath of the Wild 2, they can kind of find a way to appease people that, preferred some of the more guided experience of the previous games in the series, and people that really appreciated the breath of fresh air that this one provided.
I see. In terms of development, though, Zelda has historically always been developed in-house, with seemingly only ports and portable entries being handled by outside developers. Do you think Zelda would benefit from a new foreign vision or leadership at any point down the line?
Nintendo's really, really stingy historically with handing off their franchises to other developers. So I don't necessarily know the likelihood of that ever happening. Whether or not, regardless, the series would benefit from it, I don't know. And like, there is undeniably a kind of like difficult to quantify Nintendo charm with Nintendo games. And I can't help but fear that if it were to get handed off to another developer, that the series might in the process kind of lose some of that charm. Like there are a lot of fans, I'm sure you've seen this before, a series, is making some mistakes, it's making some issues. The fans come in there, they propose, what if the series did, X, Y, and Z to fix all of its issues? And it's like, that sounds really good. That sounds like it would be purely a net positive for the series. But then if it does that, like, it almost kind of like, you can't help but fear that it might become a little bit too predictable, too kind of like, I lack the word to kind of properly describe what I'm driving at here.
Are you trying to tell me right now that you wouldn't like to see a Zelda game handled by Bethesda and called Zelda 76 at any point down the line?
Zelda 76. Well, that's... See, I thought you were going in the direction of, would you like to see a Zelda game handled by Bethesda, period? I'd be like, well, that would be an interesting proposition, but specifically you saying 76 is like, I don't know about that.
Thought so.
I guess, like, let me put it this way. I think one of the things that I love about Nintendo is that they're always finding ways to kind of surprise you and to kind of take you off back. Their games always contain weird, unusual, and goofy elements that you never in a million years would have ever thought of. And I fear that if the Legend of Zelda series were to be handed off to another developer, that said developer wouldn't do a very good job of that. They would do a good job of listening to fans and addressing kind of long-standing complaints that fans have had, but they wouldn't do a very good job of surprising fans and catching them off guard.
Clear. Even if it was a development studio like Ni no Kuni's Level 5, for example?
here's the thing. I don't want to say no, never, not in a million years. See, I feel like something like level 5, though. I mean, I feel like that kind of changes the question a little bit, because level 5 is pretty Nintendo-like,
sure,
in terms of their design philosophy. So, maybe. Let's just leave that at a maybe.
We'll leave this in the realm of speculation then. So, out of all the entries in the franchise, what would you consider to be the strongest, and subsequently your favorite ones?
It's a pretty easy question for me. I'd say that in terms of 2D Zeldas, I am still very fond of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. It was the first game in the series that I played. It's the Super Nintendo Zelda game. I feel like it took a lot of the what was great about the original Legend of Zelda and its sequel, Zelda 2, on the NES, and just, cranked it up to 11 on the Super Nintendo and created the Zelda formula, as it were, that we all know and love today. And I think that more than that, it's still a game that has a lot of charm, a lot of heart, and is, in general, aged very well. There are a lot of games from that era that are obscenely difficult and hard, and this one has its moments of frustration, but it's absolutely still doable today. And in terms of 3D, for me, it's Twilight Princess. I kind of came in to Twilight Princess, I'd say a little bit after the initial kind of like furor surrounding, the Twilight Princess versus Wind Waker debates had died down. And as a result, I feel like I was able to kind of enjoy it without feeling like I needed to kind of take a side as I was enjoying it. I kind of just was able to enjoy it as it was. And what I found as a result of that was a just really good game with a really kind of likable cast of characters in not just, obviously Link and Zelda, but also Midna, who's like the imp-like creature that follows Link around, and a lot of the other companions that Link meets along the way. I got that game when it was released on the Wii U a little while back, and I've yet to play it. And I really do want to make a point of playing through it again, because that game ranks very highly in my list of favorite games of all time.
I see. So if I ever were to emulate a Zelda game on a PC, you'd say Twilight Princess is probably the one that I should start with?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think that, there will always be things that you miss out if you start with a later game in the series. Like, in theory, if you had infinite time and infinite, money and infinite interest on your hands, I would say to start from the beginning and kind of see where you go from there. But I think that Twilight Princess is a pretty good starting off point. One of the criticisms that people had of the game is that it was, in beat for beat, kind of similar to Ocarina of Time. But in a way, that's almost kind of a good thing in your case, because it's sort of like, well, now you don't need to play Ocarina of Time.
Okay, cool. Understood. So really quickly, do you think that Zelda would translate well to the silver screen? And if so, how should this be handled? For example, would you prefer a live action or a 3D animated film in this regard?
Ooh, there was like sometime in the past, there was like this Spanish 3D animated short movie that was created to promote the Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Somebody who's going to watch this video is going to know exactly what I'm talking about. It looked real weird, but it was also created at the time of Majora's Mask. So I'd imagine that a 3D animated film would probably look really good today. I think that movies like, for example, Spider-Man Enter the Spider-Verse showcased how you can, make a 3D animated film and have it look really, really kind of stylized and really, really cool. Yeah. And I'm going to say that, I'd say that that's probably my answer. A 3D animated Zelda film, with a high level of stylization akin to Spider-Verse is probably the way to go. I think you could probably do a live action adaptation could probably work, but I feel like if you do that, you risk having it too easily compared to, series like The Witcher or movies like Thor, for example. And I feel like it's important that Zelda kind of sets itself apart.
I see. You don't want it to be a Marvel impersonation of any kind. Okay.
Yeah, and I'd have to imagine that they'd probably if they were to ever do a live action film, they'd probably in that regard try and really set it apart in terms of its writing, in terms of its characters. I think that there's a lot they can do still there, but yeah, I'd prefer a animated flick.
Awesome. So Nintendo has kind of announced that they're keeping in line with the direction that Breath of the Wild took for the next entry in the Zelda franchise. Do you agree with this? And what are your kind of general thoughts on the future of Zelda as a whole?
I mean, as I discussed earlier, I hope that they can, figure out with Breath of the Wild 2 a way to compromise with fans that wanted a kind of slightly more linear and guided experience, and fans that were really happy with the direction that the original Breath of the Wild went into. If there is one problem that I feel like the Zelda series has consistently struggled from here and there, it's that there are definitely times where the kind of story layer to the Zelda series has not been quite as thick as you wish it were. If you think about a video game as the human body, and the gameplay are the kind of muscles and organs within the human body, and the skin is the story kind of wrapping all around it, there have definitely been instances where it's apparent that, okay, the skin here is pretty thin, and I don't feel like they're going to make a drastic change like this quite so quickly. But I do hope that with Breath of the Wild 2, they do try and thicken the skin a little bit more.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I believe that wraps it up, the interview that is. Thank you, Alexander, for answering my questions.
Thank you, Eilert.
No problem at all. If you, the viewer, are new to our content, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and our Prime channel if you haven't checked that out as well. And please also follow us on Twitter. My handle is the Ailert. And Alexander?
You can follow me at Alex Kozina, AlexKozina. And you can also catch me live on twitch.tv/CozyBearLive. KOZIBEARLIVE.
Yeah, you can find all of the links to our social channels in the description below if you ever wonder where they are. So, until next time, goodbye.
Ciao.